Bien, je pense que nous pouvons commencer. Aujourd'hui, nous avons une pendule qui marche, donc nous devrions pouvoir terminer donc à peu près à l'heure, encore que le professeur Shaughnessy vient de me dire qu'il a beaucoup plus de choses à dire que dans l'espace d'une heure, donc on va peut-être être amené à déborder un tout petit peu. Bienvenue une fois de plus dans cette salle du Collège de France pour accueillir les conférences du professeur Shaughnessy qui, depuis déjà 2 semaines, nous entretient sur donc les versions exhumées de certains classiques de la tradition confucéenne chinoise. Donc il a commencé par traiter du livre du changement, donc le jeudi. La semaine dernière, il a continué sur le livre des documents, donc le Shangshu. Et aujourd'hui, donc c'est le tour d'un classique parmi les classiques, à savoir donc le corpus poétique du Shi, du Shijing. La semaine prochaine, donc, il continuera sur un corpus qui n'est pas considéré comme confucéen, mais encore que on pourrait encore en discuter. Mais la semaine prochaine, il sera question du Laozi. Mais aujourd'hui, donc, nous écoutons le professeur Shaughnessy sur le Shijing. Donc, merci.
Thank you very much. I have nothing to do in Paris every day, and so it's very hard for me to know even what day of the week it is, except I know that when Thursday I'm supposed to be here. But now I notice from this slide that it's already the 20th of June, and so my 1 month in Paris is racing by. I'm almost at an end, and also I know that the talks that I've been giving, I feel like I'm racing through the talks because there's so much material that I want to share with you, and there's so little time really to do it. So let me not spend time making excuses this morning, but rather to move on as I have done in the past 2 lectures to mention a prominent French sinologist of an earlier period. And of course, if we're talking about the classic of poetry, the Shijing, the name that comes immediately to mind is Marcel Granet. And Granet, I think I don't need to remind anyone here, was a very prolific writer. The books that he published are displayed on the screen in front of you. The first of his books, and in many ways, I think the most original, not necessarily the best, but the most original book, and the book that had the greatest influence in China is the one that is on the left-hand side of the screen, Fait et Chanson in Ancienne de la Chine, and it was about the classic of poetry. He took a sociological approach to understanding the poems, and he said that he was explicitly avoiding any sort of symbolic interpretation of the poems. This notion of the social and cultural context of the poetry was then picked up by a young Chinese scholar of the time named Wen Duo, and developed in, I think, different directions, a similar approach, but taken in different directions. And because of Wen Duo's influence in China, then has developed into a kind of new interpretation of the classic of poetry, just as the new interpretation of the classic of changes that I talked about 2 weeks ago. I'll come back to this a little bit, perhaps, But just in terms of the classic of poetry, I think most of you are already well aware of the poetry, but in the Han Dynasty bibliography first by Liu Xin and then picked up by Bangu, they describe the poetry as this famous statement from the Classic of Documents that poetry gives voice to the will, 诗言志, and songs give music to the voice. And so this is what poetry is supposed to be about, an expression of the inner emotions that people have. It's supposed to have been spontaneous expressions of the people's sentiment in ancient China, and that there was an official in the government, at least ideally, an official in the government who would go and collect the folk songs that people were singing and use that to remonstrate with the king, with the ruler, to tell the ruler what the people's sentiments were. There must have been thousands of these poems. Indeed, in one count, there were 3,000 such poems, of which Confucius, in the 6th century BC, is said to have selected 305 pieces, it says, which is what we currently have. There are also 6 titles for which we don't have any lyrics or any poetry, but usually we talk about the 300 poems of the classic of poetry. The last sentence of this short paragraph that describes the poetry says, coming to the Qin, that it was still complete is because it was set to music and not simply on bamboo and silk. And this is a roundabout way of referring to that bibliocost, the burning of the books in 213 BC that I mentioned last week in terms of the Classic of Documents. I'm going to spare you that cartoon picture of the first emperor burning the books. But here, the notion is that they didn't need to have a text of the Shijing, of the classic of poetry, written on bamboo and silk because it was lyrics of songs that everyone had memorized, so that it was possible for the text to be transmitted across the divide of the Qin dynasty from the Warring States period until the Han period, transmitted orally but faithfully. Just to refresh your memory as to what the classic of poetry is like, the text as we find it today in 305 poems is divided primarily into 3 or 4 different sections. Though the first section is called the Feng, the Guofeng, the heirs of the states. There are 160 of these poems, though the first 2 sections are referred to as Nan, as the South, but is probably a musical term, the Zhounan and the Shaonan. And then the heirs of the states are divided up among, how many is it? 13 different states that were independent entities in North China at the time. So 160 poems in all. These are the poems that Marcel Granet was particularly interested in. These are also the poems that most of us read and love. These are the folk songs that the officials were sent out into the countryside to collect. It's also probably in most university courses that teach the classic of poetry, these are the poems that people read. because it's at the beginning of the book as we find it, and people run out of time before they get to the other sections of the poetry. And there are two main sections, the ya, which is sometimes translated as the elegantia. Ya is a word for proper language, for elegance. I translate it more functionally as encomia, because these are songs, many of which were, I think, sung after dinner and were intended to describe the exploits of one or another person who had achieved some sort of great accomplishment. And these are divided between the xiaoya and the daya. And there are 74 poems in the xiaoya and 31 in the daya. The division is both generic. The xiaoya are much closer to the airs of the states in their nature. The daya are much more formal, much more concerned with events at the royal capital than are the xiaoya. They're probably also differentiated in terms of date. The daya seem to be earlier, perhaps from the 9th and 8th centuries BC, the xiaoya from the 8th and probably 7th centuries BC. Whereas the guofeng are later still, from the 7th and maybe even down to about 600 BC. The last type of poem in the classic of poetry is the song, and this is divided into three different areas that produced song. There is the Zhou song. These are liturgies that were sung at state sacrifices in the capital of the Western Zhou dynasty. The Lu song from the state of Lu that eventually produced Confucius in western Shandong province near the capital of Jinan, the capital city of Shandong. And then the Shang song, which should not be understood as poems that go back to the Shang dynasty, but rather poems that were sung in the state of Song, which was the successor state to the Shang dynasty. And even though they sing of the exploits of the Shang kings, there's good reason to believe that these were written, composed at a very late date, towards the end of the 7th century BC. So the earliest of the poems are the Zhou song. I don't have a pointer today, but the Zhou song, some of which I think go back to the very beginnings of the Western Zhou dynasty, about 1000 BC. And then the latest poems date from about 600 BC. And there's a range in between that 400-year, during that 400-year interval, over which the daya and the xiaoya were composed. The Zhou song poems, as I say, are liturgical chants that were sung during sacrifices. I think very few college courses, other than at the University of Chicago, ever get to these, because this particular poem, for instance, Wojiang, is number 272 in the sequence of 305 poems, and most people spend their time reading the airs of the states, and then they can excuse themselves for not getting to the Zhou song, because with big books you never get to the end. It's also that these poems in the Zhou song don't have a great deal of poetic interest for most people. And I think if you read this which is I think a fairly neutral translation. It is my translation into English, but it doesn't have any agenda necessarily. We present, we offer, it's a sheep, it is an ox, it's heaven that receives them, and then calling on King Wen, the nominal founder of the Zhou dynasty, as having established a model for us to follow. Daily we pacify the four quarters. Oh, blessed is King Wen. Having made sacrifice to him, may we morning and night stand in awe of heaven's wrath and here protect it. It's enjoyable for me to read this because I spend a lot of time reading bronze inscriptions, and I can hear resonances from bronze inscriptions where people are calling on their ancestors to protect them. But in terms of real aesthetic appeal, I suspect most people won't share my interest in this poem. It's the kind of liturgical chant that we would hear probably in many churches in the world. The Daya, which I called the greater encomia, I think developed out of after-dinner entertainment. After the feast, after the sacrifice, people would come together for a sacrifice. Then they would have the dinner, and then after dinner, a scribe or a poet would come in and sing of the exploits, probably of the host of the dinner, or of some other great figure who was present at the dinner. And this is one example. There are 31 of these poems, some of which sing of the exploits of people, some of which have complaints written into them, complaining about conditions at the court. But if you were to read through this, it's about a particular person named Hu of Shao. He's actually a member of one of the greatest families of the Western Zhou state, and a very important figure at the Zhou court about 825 BC. But he led an army to attack people in the Huai River Valley, which is found today in basically in Anhui province, going from Henan into Anhui. And this has some poetic interest to it, so that the Jiang and the Han River are bubbling and the warriors crest upon crest. So the idea of the water flowing and the warriors probably walking along the water course, flowing just as water does as they move to the east. But then there's a political meaning to this. It's not for peace, it's not for sport, but it's the Huai that we have come to catch. And then it goes on to describe how Hu of Shao has led this army to the east, and it goes on at some length. These are quite lengthy poems, at least within the Chinese tradition. And finally, the king gives Hu of Shao a mandate after the successful completion of the military campaign, and Hu of Shao brings his army back to the capital. The king gives him a command and awards him a jade plaque and a spoon and a bucket of sweet liquor, and tells him that he's also giving him some fields, lands that he'll be in charge of. And then Hu of Shao bows and touches his head to the ground and extols the beneficence of the Son of Heaven for 10,000 years. And then he makes for his ancestor, the Duke of Shao, a probably a vessel. He says he's making this poem for him, but the poem is actually very much like the inscription on a bronze vessel. And there's some reason to think that this is the text that would go on a bronze vessel. And finally, returns at the very last two lines to say that the Son of Heaven is illustrious, and his fame will never end, and it will extend throughout all four quarters of the empire. This, too, is a poem that most people don't read, or if they read it for historical interest rather than poetic interest. And many people have drawn the connection between that poem and inscriptions on bronze vessels. And I have just chosen one bronze vessel here with an inscription from about the same period, about 825 BC, simply because this is the most recent acquisition of the Art Institute of Chicago. It's a very beautiful, very large and imposing vessel. And the caster of it is not Hu of Shao. And we actually have bronze vessels that were made by Hu of Shao, and also other bronze vessels that mention that figure. So the same figure that we see in the classic of poetry. But it's a figure who was contemporary with him, and the language of the inscription shares many of the same expressions that first, the accomplishments of the person making the vessel are described. Then he responds to the king's grace, saying, "May the king live for 10,000 years." And then he dedicates the making of the vessel to his own ancestors and expresses the wish that his own ancestors will protect his sons, indeed sons' sons and grandsons' grandsons, that they will eternally use and treasure this particular vessel. So the classic of poetry can be read in conjunction with the excavated materials from the Western Zhou dynasty. And indeed, many people who talk about excavated text are very interested in reading back and forth between the poetry and these materials. But in the West, that has not been a very dominant strain in the reading of the classic of poetry, because once again, these poems have some poetic interest, but in terms of symbolism, they probably don't have universal appeal. If you're particularly interested in the China of the 9th century BC, you'll love these poems. If you're more prone to read French poetry, maybe this type of poetry won't appeal to you so much. Rather, what you will find of interest will be the heirs of the states, the Guofeng. And I mentioned just three figures here. Zhu Xi, the great scholar and philosopher of the 12th century, who was a great fan of the heirs of the states portion of the classic of poetry. Marcel Granet, of course, as I already mentioned, and then Wenyi Duo, who I also mentioned, who have studied the heirs of the states. Wenyi Duo, I said, was inspired by Granet's work, but I think took it in somewhat more interesting directions. He was convinced that the heirs of the states were full of symbolic meaning, that when they referred to certain animals or certain trees or certain flowers, that it wasn't just an exercise in zoological description or botanical description, but rather those animals had a symbolic meaning. The trees, if it's an oak tree, it stands for strength. If it is a pine tree, it stands for longevity. Flowers have different meanings for different occasions and different contexts. And Wanidua was particularly attuned to those different meanings. I'm going to give just a few examples of the airs of the states. And there are 160 of them. I could have picked 160 to display to you, but time passes very quickly. We have an old theater in Chicago called the Art Cinema, and over the door into the theater it says, all passes, art alone endures. And time certainly passes, but art endures. And here we see a poem of 3 stanzas that is very simple. It's simply a kind of wedding song, a kind of song about looking for a young lady. A young man is thinking about what kind of a girl he might be interested in, and talks about beneath the transverse gate. Actually, if you know something about the cultural history of ancient China, perhaps it enhances your understanding of this poem, or perhaps it detracts from it, because the transverse gate was the section of the city that housed the brothels. So it was the red light district of the town. As I say, I don't know if that enhances or detracts from your understanding of this, but you can settle down there interestingly, leisurely, and by the spring's full flowing, you can sate your hunger. Your hunger, of course, is a sexual hunger, and how do you satisfy that hunger? Well, could it be fish to eat? And if it's fish, then do you have to have a bream from the Yellow River? Bream, very large, and in the Chinese tradition, one of the most delicious fish that you can possibly eat. It's still quite expensive in China. And then if you're looking for a wife, does she have to be a jiang of qi, which in the American tradition would probably be the equivalent. Does she have to be a Rockefeller or a Kennedy? And then the next stanza is very much the same. The interest that Wanidua brought to this poem is to see that fish in ancient China were always a symbol of sexuality. And so eating fish, of course, is not just a matter of satisfying your hunger, but is a metaphor for satisfying your sexual desires. And I'm going to take this because one of the most famous articles that Wanidua published was simply entitled "On Fish," and it was a long article where he explored fish as a metaphor. And we see here in yet another of the airs of the states, this one called the ninefold net, or the jiuyu, that we have this net out to catch fish, and we're looking for rudd and bream. Again, very good fish. And I've met this boy, and he has an embroidered shirt, so a handsome young man. And then I've met this fish, but then all of a sudden a wild goose comes along, and then the boy seems to leave. And the last stanza once again, the wild geese, and the boy leaves for some reason, and I can't lodge the night with you. I don't spend the night with you. We can, I think, appreciate this just as poetry. It's a story of a girl who meets a boy, and then something happens, and then the boy leaves. But for Chinese readers for several 2,000 years, one of the interests has been with correlative thought, that why are the fish mentioned as a way of exciting or introducing, stimulating the interest that the girl has in a boy? Why is this goose mentioned? What's the relationship between the natural world and the human world? And it's a trope that is found throughout the airs of the states and referred to in the Chinese tradition as a Cheng, something that uplifts, that causes to arise one sense in the, so it has one meaning in the natural realm, but it causes you, it evokes a corresponding notion in the human realm. And Wenyi, reason I focus on this, Wenyi was particularly attuned to the symbolic resonances of things like fish and geese. And I actually, in much that I've done with the Classic of Changes, have talked about wild geese because it's very, very strange transformation in ancient China that from the Han Dynasty on, the wild geese were always given as wedding presents because geese apparently mate for life. And so it was a particularly appropriate present for a young bride and groom who it was hoped would mate for life. But in the poetry of the Classic of Poetry, it seems that the geese always introduce some sort of marital discord, divorce of some sort. And why should that be? Even Wenyi never picked up on this, but I've written on it quite a bit. This is a poem about the soldiers coming into town and a young girl looking at them, and they're all dressed in their military finery, and she sees them carrying their daggers and spears, and they have their red knee covers. The red knee covers, of course, symbolizing that they're on official business, that they're important people. And then she says there's a pelican on the bridge who doesn't wet his wings. That young man over there doesn't fit his clothing. So once again, he's dressed as a soldier, apparently very imposing. I understand some young girls are turned on by guys in military clothing. I've never worn them myself, but there's a pelican on the bridge who doesn't wet his beak. That young man over there doesn't pursue his date. And then finally, oh, how dense, oh, how lush, south mountains, morning mist. Oh, how cute, oh, how charming is this hunger of the young girl. So the young girl with her hunger that is not satisfied. But the interest of this poem is with the pelican on the bridge who doesn't wet his wings, who doesn't wet his beak, and the boy, the young man in his military clothing who doesn't follow up on his date. Is there some sort of a correlation between the natural image of the pelican and the soldier? Well, if we stop and think that a pelican is a fish eater, and it has to dip its beak into the water to get its fish, and then if we go with Wenyi to the idea that fish throughout the Classic of Poetry always symbolize sexual relations, then for the pelican not to eat the fish is the same as the young boy not following up on his date with the girl. And I think that this reading makes this poem much more interesting to me. If we have time today, and Professor Cheng said that maybe I can take a couple, 10 more minutes than the 12 o'clock deadline, maybe I will come back to the most famous poem of the classic of poetry. It is the very first poem, Guanju, and I'll try to go back to this notion of the pelican not eating the fish and suggest to you a new interpretation of that first and most famous poem of the classic of poetry. As with so many books in ancient China, I mentioned this with the Classic of Changes, we all read the very first poem, and many classes in China, I think, don't ever get beyond the first poem because there's so much commentary about it that it can take an entire semester. But my charge today and throughout these lectures is not to introduce the classic of poetry, but rather to introduce the excavated material that has been discovered over the last 30 or 40 years. And in the case of the classic of poetry as well, there has been a great deal of material that's been discovered over this period. The very first discovery was made in 1977, 1978, right at the end of 1977, beginning of 1978, at the site of Fuyang in Anhui province, which also produced a text of the Classic of Changes. But in that same discovery, it was a library that would have been tremendously important, almost as important as the famous Mawangdui library that was discovered just 4 years before this, in 1973. But all of the text from Fuyang were written on bamboo strips. And unfortunately, the tomb was burgled very shortly after it was closed, and it caused the roof of the tomb to collapse, and some of the big beams of the roof fell right on top of the lacquer hamper that contained the bamboo strips. And then the tomb filled with water. And over the course of 2,000 years, the combination of the water making the bamboo strips soft and these heavy ceiling beams pressing down upon the bamboo strips caused them to fuse together. And they're described as coming out of the tomb looking like a 1,000-layer cake. And the archaeologists then had the task in the early 1980s of trying to pry off the layer after layer of these bamboo strips. And they did it in those days with just a knife, just cutting it. And sometimes when the knife touched the bamboo, it just crumbled into dust. At other times, they would peel a strip of bamboo off, but the ink of the strip below it would adhere to the back of this bamboo strip, and then they would have to read that in a mirror image. So it's, once again, remarkable that anything was salvaged from this tomb. But one of the things that was salvaged, and the very first thing to be published, was a text of the classic of poetry. And it's not nearly as complete as the text of the Classic of Changes that was discovered in the same site. About 170 fragments of the text. And this is just a few of them displayed there for you to see. But it's a representative sample. Most of the strips are about maybe 6, 7, 8 centimeters long. And it's possible to know something of what this manuscript looked like. We know that each single bamboo strip, and they would have been about, in their entirety, about 25 or 26 centimeters long, had the text of one stanza of one poem of the Classic of Changes. And the characters were written in different sizes. So if the stanza were longer, they would write in smaller characters. If the stanza were shorter, they would write in larger characters so as to fill up a single bamboo strip. And the text is identifiably that of the classic of poetry, which is to say that it shows a number of different spellings, if you will, different ways of writing characters or different characters for the same word, which is very common for the Western Han Dynasty. And this tomb dates to 165 BC. So this was the first discovery of the classic of poetry from an ancient tomb, once again made in 1977. I should mention too that there were early reports that this manuscript included a preface that's very much like the Han Dynasty preface to the classic of poetry, and which is probably the most famous statement of literary criticism in the Chinese tradition. But after 20 years or so of discussion back and forth as to whether or not the few fragments that seem to be a poem, a preface, really are, the considered opinion today is that they don't constitute anything similar to the preface to the poetry that we now know. 15 years later, in Wuhan province, in Hubei province, just to the west of Wuhan, at a place called Guodian, very famous, and we'll hear much more about it next week because of because of 3 texts that included materials that correspond to the received text of the Lao Tzu, or the classic of the Way and Virtue. But there were many other texts included in this site. And the great significance of the Guodian discovery was that for the first time they had found philosophical and or literary text from before the Qin unification of the script, if there was such and before the Qin burning of the books. So the tomb dates to about 300 BC. And many of the texts, which are Confucian in nature, but many of the texts quote the classic of poetry, almost as certainly as its scriptural source, as its kind of proof text, that there will be a philosophical argument made, and then the QED is that the poetry says, and the poetry confirms what we're arguing here. So many of the texts in this discovery mention the classic of poetry. And there too, there's certainly orthographic differences between the way the quotations of the poetry are written and the way we know them to be written from the Han Dynasty on, but the orthographic differences aside, these quotations match almost word for word with the received text of the classic of poetry. The interpretations are sometimes different than what we later hear, but the text, it certainly was already available to be quoted by people even in I wouldn't say a relative backwater, such as Jingzhou, because it was the capital of the state of Chu, of the country of Chu. was a very important intellectual center. But it certainly was prevalent throughout the Chinese realm. I mentioned 2 weeks ago, with respect to the Classic of Changes, that at the same time that the tomb at Guodian was being excavated by archaeologists, another tomb, probably within the environs of the same cemetery, was burgled. We can only say probably because, of course, tomb robbers don't admit to where they robbed their tombs. We know that in early 1994, so just 2 months after the Guodian tomb was excavated by archaeologists, that in a big cache of bamboo strips came onto the antique market in Hong Kong. And within 2 months after that, the Shanghai Museum bought the entire cache of bamboo strips, something like 1,200 strips in all. And then between 1994 and 2000, they spent cleaning the strips, preserving them, and of course, organizing them. The Chinese term of organizing bamboo strips is essentially doing all the kinds of editorial chores that one needs to do, dividing them into different text, then trying to transcribe them. And after you transcribe them, then trying to make sense of the text. And the very first text that the Shanghai Museum editors published, and they published this in 2001, was a text called Confucius's Poetry Discussion, the Kongzi Shilun. And it is just what the title describes it as being, put in the words of Confucius, comments by Confucius on the poetry. And there are about 50 or 60 poems mentioned by title. A few are quoted, but it is an essay that purports to discuss the significance of the classic of poetry. Unfortunately, you can see here, it's in 29 bamboo strips in all, but it certainly was not the entirety of the text. Any number of bamboo strips had been lost. Others are broken. Perhaps they're to be arranged in this way, which is the arrangement that the editors of the Shanghai Museum arrived at. But perhaps they should be organized differently. And within a few months of the publication of this book, there were 6 different arrangements of the 29 bamboo strips. And if you, and the numbers there refer to the numbers that the Shanghai Museum gave to the strips. So they, of course, organized it from number 1 to number 29. But if you look at the other 5 arrangements of these bamboo strips, of 29 bamboo strips, you'll discover that there's not a consensus regarding even 2 of the bamboo strips. Everybody comes up with a different ordering. And the word edit in Chinese is to put the bamboo strips in sequence. And the sequence that you arrive at is going to determine very much what your understanding of the text is. And I think still to this day, there is no consensus about what the Kongzi Shilun really means. I might mention just in passing that in 2000, the text was presented at a scholarly conference in Beijing. And the very first strip was displayed in a PowerPoint display such as this, but much larger, and a reference to Kongzi. And the two most famous paleographers in China, the two greatest authorities, Li Xueqin and Qiu Xigui, they both said, we don't think that should be read as Kongzi, as Confucius, but rather they said it should be read as Buzi. Buzi is one of Confucius's disciples, Zishang, and who was supposed to have been particularly concerned with the classic of poetry. And there was great excitement at the conference as to whether this should be Confucius or Buzi. And most people were convinced by the authority of these two great paleographers that it should not be Confucius at all. Of course, the editors at the Shanghai Museum were just chuckling to themselves because they had plenty of evidence proving that it should be read as Confucius, but back in the museum. And then the next year, when they published the volume, they presented the evidence as well, proving that it should be read as Confucius. And the proof is that this person who, whether it's Kongzi or Buzi, but in a subsequent line refers to himself as I Qiu, and Qiu was Confucius's given name. It's quite clear that the Shanghai editors were right in that reading. But whether their reading of these 29 strips is correct is still an open question. And then finally, last week I mentioned the Tsinghua University corpus of bamboo strips, almost twice the size of the Shanghai Museum corpus, something like 2,300 bamboo strips, and only came onto the antique market in Hong Kong in, I think, 2007, and was contributed to Tsinghua University by some anonymous alumnus in 2009. Mentioned that there are materials regarding the very first volume of this had materials that correspond to text in the Classic of Documents. The third volume that was just published in December of last year has a number of text with poetry. Most of the poetry is of the same sort as found in the Heirs of the States section of the Classic of Poetry, but does not correspond exactly. There is one poem, however, which is called Qiyie, which says that it's written at the time of King Wu, so the founder of the Western Zhou dynasty, and just before the conquest of the Shang dynasty. And it was immediately after a battle that's against, and this battle is known from historical records. And a number of people were there together, great figures. The founding fathers of the Western Zhou dynasty are all together, and they have their wine goblets in hand, and they're making poems as they toast each other. And the king makes the first poem. And so here's the poem in my translation. Pleasing, pleasing the tasty brew, celebrated with the two dukes. Trusty and good are my brothers, the commoners join in union. Very manly, very martial, solemnly achieving the state. The fine chalice is quickly drunk, another chalice then follows. And these are in part drinking songs. Drink up, my friends, we've won a great victory, and have some political significance that we're ruling the state. We're coming close to achieving our great victory. And then the Duke of Zhou, the king salutes the Duke of Zhou and talks about chariots and racing them and so forth. You can read those for yourself. The Duke of Zhou returns the compliment by making a poem, and he dedicates this to the king, and says, "Bright, bright is God on high, looking down on the light below. Illustrious he comes on in, imbibing the fragrant brightness, the spirit, the alcohol." Unfortunately, there's a break in the text here, and it's unusual for these Tsinghua bamboo strips because most of them are intact, but a few of them are broken. And then it finishes, and one of the interesting things about the Tsinghua strips is that they're numbered. They have numbers at the very bottom of the strip so that we know which order to put them back into. The moon has its completed path, Jupiter its standard motion. I'm making this prayerful chant for myriad long life unlimited, which is a standard kind of ending to a poem, that this is a prayer for long life. And the Duke of Zhou then, having made the poem, grabs his chalice and is about to drink. But before he drinks, the text continues that a cricket, a xishuai, hopped up into the hall where they were drinking. And then the Duke of Zhou made a song called Cricket. And this is, he starts off by saying, "A cricket in the hall, war chariot like its movements." Okay, so once again, describing something in the natural world in terms of our human realm, the political realm. And then he goes on, "We have the noble sons greatly pleased, greatly amused. But don't let yourself be too amused, for in the end you'll find peace. Peace and amusement without forgetting. This is the square of the fine man." And then it goes on actually for 3 stanzas of the cricket. A cricket is on the mat, a cricket is in the house, and then the continuation with the human realm. What is very interesting about this is that there is a poem in the classic of poetry called Cricket, Xishuai, and it's very similar to this particular poem. It's not exactly the same, but it shares several lines in common. And what this particular poem does for us, what this story does, is provide the context. Why did a poem such as Cricket find its way into the classic of poetry? Why were people, of course, crickets throughout Chinese history have been a very important cultural amusement for Chinese people. But why is it in this canonical poetical source? I don't think that this story goes back to the early Western Zhou dynasty. The story was written about 300 BC. But at least there is this tradition that this story has that kind of a compositional context to it, which is great fun for people who read the classic of poetry and wonder, where did they get the ideas behind these stories? So it just so happened that one day a cricket jumped into the hall. As the Duke of Zhou and King Wu were drinking their toast, celebrating the victory at Qi. Now, the clock is working here. It's 11:59, and I have finished what I need to do here, which is to introduce the material from the recent excavations. I have promised, and I will race through this, to talk about the very first poem in the classic of poetry, the poem that most people who have read this text have read and enjoyed for at least 2,000 years. And I want to suggest to you an interpretation that people in China have not suggested. I understand that one king of Korea suggested something similar to what I'm going to suggest to you. But the poem starts off, this too is a love poem. It's a marriage song. It's about a boy trying to find a girl. But it starts off in the same way that the pelican on the bridge starts off. Here we have an osprey, sometimes called a fish hawk. It's a bird that dives into both freshwater and saltwater, is a fish-eating bird. And it starts off by saying, guan, guan, and then the name of the bird, the jujiu. And guan, guan is said to be just the sound that this osprey makes. And it's on the island in the river. And then there's this young girl who's described as being very juicy, yao tiao. And she would be a fine mate for the junzi hao chou. And then we have him going out, and this is a trope that Granet was particularly interested in, going out and collecting flowers and things here in the rivers. He's going through collecting watercress to the left and right, chasing it. And then the young girl, again, is described as luscious or something like that. And throughout the night, he's thinking of her and he can't sleep. And the next day, he's out seeking her, but not getting her. In and out of sleep, he thinks, he's tossing and turning, can't get her out of his mind. And then he's collecting the watercress, and then finally, with zither and lute, he befriends her. And in the traditional interpretation of this poem, this is understood to be the wedding engagement, the engagement to be married, that these are the kinds of instruments, string music, that we play. Of course, for many young boys who are courting a girl and taking them maybe to an Italian restaurant where they play a violin, and the string instrument is the instrument of courtship par excellence. And then in the final stanza, this is supposed to be the wedding. Up and down the watercress, left and right, gathering it. Luscious is the young girl, and then bell and drum amusing her. So now we have this percussive music that is supposed to be the music of the marriage ceremony itself. And Granet talked a great deal about wedding customs in ancient China. And he was particularly interested in when during the year there would be an engagement party, when the unions were announced, and then when the marriage would take place. I actually have been more interested in the very first line of this. Guan guan jujiu. Why is this osprey calling out guan guan? Is it just the sound? Maybe. In the Song Dynasty, the only person who's really commented on this, a person who said that birds make different sounds depending on the shape of their beak. So that geese and ducks who have flat bills make sounds like guan guan. Whereas chickens and pheasants who have pointy beaks, they make sounds like ow ow. And so he says the osprey's beak is like that of a duck or a goose, and therefore it makes the sound guan guan. That's a comment that Granet, I think, would have found favor with, because he wanted to eschew all symbolic interpretation. So this is the natural interpretation, the logical interpretation. But I don't think it's the right interpretation, because we find out that there are geese who are supposed to have flat bills and make the sound guan guan, but here we find that their calls are ow ow. Sometimes they make calls that are yong yong. So it doesn't really matter. If we had more time to talk about what this ow ow is, the call that the goose makes here, ow ow, is written with a word that in Chinese means arrogant. And indeed, it goes on to say that having heard these geese calling out ow ow, then those dumb men say we're haughty, and actually doesn't use the same word, but the same idea, that there's arrogance involved. Or in this case, where the goose is saying yung yung, it's a word that means bottled up, dammed up, that doesn't allow you to cross over. And the whole poem is about a girl trying to cross over the river. And when she hears the geese saying yung yung, then she feels like she's stuck. So back to the notion of the osprey here, making this sound. If I had prepared in advance, if I had thought that I would get to this, I would have a YouTube video for you of what an osprey sounds like. And it is nothing like guan guan. I guarantee you that it's nothing like guan guan. And you'll also see that its beak is nothing like the beak of a goose or a duck. The sound that an osprey makes, someone described it as a creaky door on a hinge. Something like, so how do you get guan guan? Well, I think the reason that guan guan is used there is because it also means to join together. And indeed, in the earliest references to this that we have from the Ma Wangdui manuscript, it's written with a character that means to string what we now know it as stringing coins together. You know that coins have a hole in the middle of it, and putting a line through that and stringing them together, but written with just two things joined together. You don't have to be terribly Freudian to see the significance of these things being joined together in that way. But if you miss it from that, then the story in this Ma Wangdui text, which describes the Guan poem, the Guanju poem, says that illustration, we argue Chinese philosophy by way of illustration. We take anecdotes from this and then push to another realm to understand the significance of it. And you take something from what you understand a little bit to try and illustrate what you understand a lot or like a lot. And luscious is the young girl in and out of sleep, seeking her, means that one's thinking of sex. Seems straightforward. It's always the way I've understood the poem. Seeking her but not getting her in and out of sleep, I think, speaks to its urgency. Longing, oh longing, oh tossing and turning over myself speaks to its being extreme. But even when it's this extreme, would you copulate beside your parents? No, no, even if you were to die, you wouldn't do that. Would you do it next to your brothers? No, you wouldn't do it next to your brothers as well. Next to your countrymen, you wouldn't do it either. So more than being in awe of your parents and brothers, it's simple decorum. It is the rites. So using sex to illustrate decorum is a matter of advancement. That's how we move forward as a civilization. And with that, I took my 10 minutes too much, and I'll stop there. But the interpretation of guan guan, as I wrote it, is join, join, rather than just onomatopoeia. Thank you very much.